The signal had been repeating for 2 days before anyone could dive it. I heard it first on the station feed, the way you hear weather you already know is coming. A thin, automated pulse out of the wreck of the Arraigne's Hope, a refugee transport that had tried to ride out a shelf storm on the surface, and lost that argument. She'd gone down nose first onto the reef ledge, hull split along the keel seam, lights out within the hour. 40 adults pulled off the upper decks before she sank. The lower decks, the lifeboat bay, nobody had gotten to yet. The water out there ran cold, and the visibility ran to nothing, and for 2 days, the only thing reaching the surface was that pulse, even and patient, the kind of signal that doesn't know yet that no one is coming. I was the only diver Brask Shelf had left who was cleared for depth. Tarrant had a shoulder that hadn't set right since the spring. Okonkwo was running triage on Survivor's topside. That left me, and a window of maybe 90 minutes before the tide turned and brought the hunters up off the trench wall the way it always did. Big, patient, drawn to the trench by the same current that fed the reef, and not particular about what kind of meat the storm had left behind for them. The station chief asked if I wanted someone standing by on the line. I told her there wasn't time to wait for someone. There was only time to go. The hull was lying on its side at 40 fathoms, lit up green-black by my own lamps, and nothing else. I went in through the cargo seam because the main airlock had crumpled like wet paper, and the inside of a dead ship is its own kind of quiet, not silence, because the water still moves, and the metal still groans settling into the reef, but quiet, the way a held breath is quiet. My lamp caught a child's shoe drifting loose in a flooded corridor, and a meal tray still strapped to a galley table, and I made myself stop reading the wreck like a story and start reading it like a map, because that was the only way I was going to find anyone alive in it. I worked my way down past the galley, past crew berths already flooded to the ceiling, following the pulse of the signal until it got loud enough that I knew I was close, and then I found the lifeboat bay, and the bay was not flooded. Someone, a crewman maybe, in the last minute before the water came up the corridor, had sealed the inner hatch and burned the last of the boat's reserve air into the compartment instead of into a launch they'd never get to use. It had bought whoever was inside 2 days. I cut the manual release with a hand torch because the boat's own systems were long dead, and when the hatch finally gave, the air that came out at me was foul and used twice over, and underneath it, small and webbed and curled into the corner, where the air pocket had been thinnest, was the child. I want to say she looked at me the way the survivors back at the station always did, with relief, with something easy to read. She didn't. Tellurine don't show it that way. Her gill slits were working too fast, shallow, the way they do when a Tellurine has been breathing borrowed air for longer than their body was built to manage, and her eyes, black, lidless, built for the deep, tracked my lamp without flinching, and without trusting it either. She had pulled her knees in tight and wedged herself against the seam where 2 walls met, the smallest target she could make of herself, and she did not move when the hatch opened. She had decided, I think, days before I got there, that whatever came through that door next would decide things for her, and there was no use spending what air she had left arguing about it. I am not going to pretend I had a plan for what to say to a Tellurine child at 40 fathoms with a hunter's tide rising behind me. I had training, and the training said, don't grab, so I didn't. I came down to her level on the flooded deck, slow, and I put my light low so it washed the compartment instead of her face, and I held my free hand open and still between us, the way you'd hold it out to anything wild and worn thin that had already decided people were a kind of weather. I didn't reach further than that. I let her be the one to close the distance, if she was going to. She didn't move for a long count of seconds, long enough that I started doing the arithmetic on my own air, against the minutes I was burning sitting still. Her gaze went from my lamp to my hand, to my face and back again, reading me the way I'd been reading the wreck, looking for the part of the map that would tell her what kind of thing I was. Tellurine trust isn't given on instinct the way it is in some species. It's a decision, made slowly, made once a body has had time to confirm that nothing worse is coming. I had no way to give her that time. I had 90 minutes that were already most of the way gone, and so I did the only honest thing left to me, which was to stay still and let her take however long the decision actually needed, even while every second of it cost me. It took longer than I had. That's the truth of it. The tide doesn't negotiate, and somewhere above the trench wall the current was already shifting, and every second I spent crouched still in that flooded bay was a second taken out of the 90 minutes I didn't have a second of to spare. I heard my own line crackle with the chief's voice asking for a status, and I didn't answer it, because answering it would have meant explaining that I had a choice in front of me that wasn't really a choice, and I didn't want to spend the air on the words. She came to my hand on her own, pressed two webbed fingers against my palm, light as the question it was, and I closed my hand around hers, just barely, just enough to be answer enough, and that was the whole of it. That was the entire negotiation. I got her into the buddy seal, and against my chest where my own air could reach her, and I went back out through the cargo seam the way I'd come, except slower now, because I would not have her thrown against bulkheads to save 4 minutes. The hunters came up off the trench wall, while I still had 30 meters of open water between the wreck and the shelf line. I saw them the way you see weather a beat before it arrives, a change in the dark, a wrongness in how the water was moving, and I did not have the air, the time, or the right to fight one. I went down instead of up, hugging the reef wall where the rock broke their lane and put stone between us and them, and I held that child against me and went hand over hand along a route I had not planned and would not be able to draw afterward if you asked me to, because I wasn't thinking it, I was just doing it, the way you do the thing your body already knows when the alternative is failing at the only job in front of you. We came up under the shelf platform's own hull shadow, out of their lane entirely, with my air gauge reading numbers I have decided not to think about since. They pulled us both out onto the platform deck into gray daylight and toweling, and shouting that I mostly didn't hear, and somebody put a thermal blanket around her before they'd even gotten my own fins off, which was right, which was the correct order of things. She held still and watched all of it with those black, unblinking eyes, still deciding, I think, what kind of weather I was going to turn out to be. The relocation officer came up from the mainland by the second day, with the forms that exist for exactly this: unclaimed minor, transport wreck origin, processing center pending placement, and I signed where I was supposed to sign and answered what I was supposed to answer, and then I told her I wasn't done yet, that I was filing for guardianship, and the officer looked at me the way people look at a number that doesn't match the form. I told her I'd fill out as many of the forms as it took. I told her there wasn't a version of this where I pulled a living thing out of a dead ship and then handed her to a building. It took 6 weeks of forms, and they were not interesting weeks, and I will not pretend otherwise. What I remember better is the 7th week, the first morning she came up the ladder to the station's top deck on her own, found the sun, and sat in it without flinching, gill slits slow and even for the first time since I'd met her. She didn't say anything. She doesn't, often, even now. But she pressed 2 fingers against my palm the way she had at 40 fathoms in the dark, and I understood by then that it was the only word she needed, and the only one I needed back.